Um, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to this event this evening. My name is Victoria Stone Cadena. I am the Associate Director at the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. I'd like to take a moment to thank my colleagues across the university who worked hard to bring this about, including the team at RITM, Jennifer Newman at the Schwarzman Center, Anoka Faruqi at the School of Art, Marlene Theodore at the Yale Art Gallery, and our interlocutors for the evening, Wendell Harrington and Dean Pinder. I'm also very delighted to formally welcome Shazia Sikander, our distinguished guest, this evening as an incoming RITM Arts and Practitioner Fellow, and you'll hear more about this as the date approaches, so keep an eye on that. A quick run of show, we'll have the presentation, and at the end, we'll open it up for questions. We just ask that you raise your hand and patiently wait for someone to come with the microphone to you so we can hear everybody. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kimberly Pinder, the Stavros Niarchos, yes, thank you, Dean of the Yale School of Art since 2001. Dr. Pinder is an internationally recognized scholar of race, representation, and public art. The author of important books, she's also widely known for her deep commitment to education and its potential to address local and national challenges. We are very grateful for your support of this event and for welcoming Shazia Sikander. I'm going to turn it to you now. Thank you so much.
Well, I know I'm super youthful looking, but it's 2021. I should have just sat up here and said, yeah, I've been here for almost 30 years. Sure. But anyway. So I'll just, many of the bios, I mean, you all had bios if you look up this event. So I'm just going to really give just a few brief remarks, little snippets from these bios, and I do recommend that you go and delve deeper into the two very accomplished people that will be on the stage tonight and learn so much more about all the things that they've done in their careers and continue to do. Shazia Sikander was born in Lahore, Pakistan, where she was from the very start a renegade by taking up the traditional practice of miniature painting during Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq's military regime at a time when the medium was deeply unpopular among young artists. Sikander earned a BFA in 1991 from the National College of Arts in Lahore, where she learned from master miniaturists Bahir Ahmad. She became the first woman to teach in the miniature painting department at NCA alongside Ahmad, and was the first artist from the department to challenge the medium's technical and aesthetic framework. Sikander's breakthrough work, The Scroll from 1989 to 90 received national critical acclaim in Pakistan, winning the prestigious Shakir Ali Award, the NCA's highest merit award, and the Haji Sharif Award for Excellence in Miniature Painting, bringing international recognition to this medium within contemporary art practices. The artist then moved to the United States to pursue an MFA at the Rhode Island School of Design from 1993 to 95. And from 1995 to 97, she participated in the core program of Glassell School of Art at the Museum of Fine Arts of Houston. I had the pleasure of meeting Shazia during a public art tour of her sculptures. One was in the Madison Square Park and on the roof of the courthouse in Manhattan. The fusion of traditional and digital art forms has been something that is very prominent in much of her practice. I was impressed when seeing the public sculptures by one, seeing her lyrical two-dimensional style in 3 dimensions and monumentally so. And 2, the deft formal dialogue that she presented across a busy Manhattan street. So the park was here, and then you crossed the street and looked up at the roof and saw her other figure. Across a busy Manhattan street and multiple stories. Her intervention on the roof of the courthouse on a plinth that had been vacated by the request to take down a racist icon of indigeneity, addressed the topic that we see often in her work: how can tradition be interrogated here? How can tradition be kept but also amended? She placed a female figure in such a site of honor, display, and authority, overlooking those entering the courthouse. This, one of these sculptures, the one that was in the park, 18-foot sculpture, Witness, was later placed at the University of Houston campus, where its majesty and message were challenged by someone removing its head. Being a scholar of public art, engaged in many conversations with some of the students that are here in this room and elsewhere about public art's impact on its audience and its vulnerability outside of safe spaces such as galleries and museums, I am eager to hear more about Shazia's experience as a public artist. And again, many of you may have read about this. She was very vocal about how she wanted the artwork damaged and vandalized to be displayed, and using that vandalism to add to the message of what she was discussing in that work. So I'm looking forward to that. That's going to be great to hear. Now I want to make sure to introduce Wendell K. Harrington, who has embraced diverse disciplines, including theater, publishing, and multi-image video design and production. As a designer of scenic projections for the stage, her work has been seen on Broadway in so many plays. I'll just mention a few of them: All the Way Annie, Driving Miss Daisy, Grey Gardens, The Elephant Man, My One and Only, and many, many more. Projection design for the opera is also one of the many things that she has done. And these include Werther at the Met, Julie Taymor's staging of The Magic Flute in Florence, Italy, Ghosts of Versailles, Grapes of Wrath, and The Juniper Tree, just to name a small handful of the productions that she has been a part of with the projection design. And I love this quote about really explaining what projection encapsulates. As she says, projected images are ephemeral. They live in another dimension and dance in a way that is like music and poetry. I just love that. It's wonderful. For her work in the theater, Ms. Harrington is the recipient of the Drama Desk Award, the Outer Critics Circle Award, the American Theater Wing Award, and the Obie Award for Sustained Excellence of Projections, among, again, many other awards. In 1979, she founded Luminous Productions, Incorporated, where for 6 years she produced and directed multi-image and video projections for numerous corporate clients. I think I'm going to end there, as I encourage you, please, to investigate more about this. The two of them have an extensive biography, and I encourage you to Google them and find even more, and great interviews too. I love doing that for this kind of prep for this. So without further ado, I would love to welcome the two of you to the stage. Thank you. And yes, Shazia, sorry. I'm supposed to take this away, right?
Yes.
I love this. Yes, this is my door prize.
Thank you. Well, good evening, and thank you everybody to be here. So I'm going to jump right in so I can manage my 30 minutes fairly fast, and then I look forward to having a great conversation. So my work is about the intermediary. It's the space between binaries. It constructs kinship systems between experience, consciousness, race, and culture. Often I use drawing as a connecting tissue, as a thread, as a thinking tool. Recently, I pivoted to sculpture. I imagined that a gesture of a thoughtful public artwork itself perhaps could be about democracy. To be able to intervene in the public space, to show who we are or who we can be in the shifting landscape of representation. Can other bodies, other diasporas,
such as South Asian women diaspora, occupy public space too? On July 8th, the sculpture was vandalized of this year. At 3 a.m., a man grabbed a hammer and decapitated it in Houston, at the University of Houston. The perpetrator climbed the 18-foot sculpture an hour before a hurricane hit. So it was very intentional. The vandalism was not just an attack on the sculpture, but on the very ideas of autonomy, free expression, and the right for women to be heard and seen. I have chosen not to repair its damage. I want to leave it beheaded for all to see the violence that speaks to its history. Instead of censoring and covering the destroyed art with a tarp, the University of Houston should encourage independence of thought and let people speak. I believe that rather than censoring or destroying art, we should embrace its ability to challenge our perspectives, to see beyond binaries, to engage with the complexities of identity, power, and history. Witness is a testament to that challenge, and its defacement only strengthens its message. The opportunity had come to me via Madison Square Park Conservancy in New York. I created 2 sculptures, Witness and Now, in 2023, both co-commissioned for temporary display at the Madison Square Park, as well as co-commissioned by the University of Houston's System of Public Art program. Both these sculptures were part of the larger multimedia project titled Hava, to breathe air life, which also included this 8-foot bronze sculpture titled Now on the roof of the courthouse of the Appellate Division for the First Department of New York State Supreme Court. The 18-foot sculpture was in the park, and there was also an AR lens titled Apparition that I collaborated on with Snapchat. The sculpture, the one on the rooftop of the courthouse, is also on view in Venice at the Biennial right now. Around that time, this was 2001, I had a small survey exhibition of my 1990s work at the Morgan Library. So I started by reflecting on my 2D practice to find ways of moving into sculpture. So the opportunity by Madison Square Park Conservancy came around that time when I had this show. But what was very interesting for me was that the show was primarily about the drawings that I had done. And they were most of the works were on paper. So they were from 1988 to 2001. And many of the works I was seeing after a long time as well as many young artists were seeing the works also for the first time. So that created this sort of a reflection of looking backward and also realizing that, the stark comparison to how works on paper are treated by institutions and museums compared to paintings or on canvas and sculpture. Works on paper are for most part kept in storage to be safeguarded from light. So it was a moment of realization that so much of the work was in great collections, but at the same time, I had never seen any of that work ever surface. It had just been in storage. So one was quite aware that one was such a token representation in the US as an Asian artist between, a very black and white culture. So I was like, how do I get out of this situation and find ways to put my work outside the institutional sort of systems or structures of the gallery or the institution, like a museum. So I walked to the courthouse, which is across the Madison Square Park, and I recall standing on the street level, looking up at the courthouse and thinking about how the figurative sculptures of the famous male philosophers and lawgivers all looked very much alike and in a state of disrepair and eerily similarity. So I saw the potential of the empty plinth, which was once occupied by the sculpture of Justinian, and that vacancy screamed for female representation. So Witness, which was in the park, became a witness to sight and sound around her, implying listening and seeing. It's also woven into its environment and is both fluid and present, with an open and non-monumental patterned skirt that breaks the glass ceiling and gives way to transparency in revealing the grass, trees, cityscape that spawn its environment. Both sculptures bear a historical connection to a painting I had created in 2000 and 2001, a slight and pleasing dislocation, an unfinished work originally conceived as part of an expansive mural at the Skadden Arps Law Firm in New York. The painted image re-envisioned the ubiquitous depiction of women and jurisprudence within the context of Western art history, refracted through a non-Western art history lens. So the inclusion of a South Asian feminine figure wielding a sword was subject to censorship on the grounds of perceived violence in the aftermath of September 11th, and I was asked to remove the project. So I thought this work was also at the in that survey at the Morgan Library, which was actually curated by Jan Howard and the Rhode Island School of Design's museum. It opened in New York, but it traveled there, but it was originally curated by them. So when I was working on that show, there were lots of younger students and PhD students that asked me to take all of this stuff out of storage and share it and tell the stories. So I was thinking, how do you tell a story of something that has been censored, sitting in storage, but it still exists as a painting? So that also was another sort of a premise for like moving into sculpture. It was like, perhaps I could make a sculpture of it because, and see how, as a case study, what would happen. So in Witness, the steel skirt is a direct reference to the architectural armature of the ceiling dome, which is in the Appellate Division Supreme Court. And the metal frame that hoists the body skyward, which for me embodied the glass ceiling through which the feminine form breaks through. The skirt was also as a space of refuge, a theme in many of my paintings done in the 1990s. So I basically took paintings that were like the Uprooted series and Housed, and I wanted to like create a link between the armature of the structure in the courthouse as well as my paintings, and then take those elements into drafting an idea for the sculpture. So the sculpture is at 18 feet, and it's large, yet it feels intimate. It offers a close encounter with the details in the form, including the intricate swirling glass mosaics on the metal skirt. This concept of a malleable, shape-shifting, expanding skirt, which was sort of a recurring motif in my practice, also became sort of a metaphoric space of collective female agency, such as this work, The Whalen Trail. And Witness, when it went to Houston, it became subject to controversy amid allegations from one of Texas' largest anti-abortion lobbies, asserting that the work enlists imagery that honors abortion and memorializes the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So under pressure, the University of Houston canceled the opening and the artist talk in February of 2024 without providing information about the artwork to the university students. So such silences create room for misinformation and confusion, and it was weeks later that the signage about the sculpture was put up next to the piece. So what is the significance of the decorative collar? Because they had a problem with that. The lace jabot on the sculpture is a nod to the feminization of the Black judicial robe popularized by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but was first introduced by Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. The sculpture's appendages suggest self-rootedness, something I've likened to immigrant women's resilience and autonomy, who carry their roots wherever they go. It is not in reference to nature or tree roots, where an absolute location or earth is required as a host. In the sculpture Witness, the female figure wears her hair also in braids that resemble two ram's horns. kind of a universal symbol of strength and wisdom, but also, most importantly, a recurring motif in the New York Appellate Courthouse, which for me was a point of reference. The ram and its horns, they decorate the arms of the iconic judge's bench chairs in the courthouse. The rams also appear on the frieze of the facade of the courthouse. The braided hair draws on the syncretic visual histories of Africa and Asia, citing early 20th century Nigerian crest masks and the spiraling snail shell hair curls that often adorn the Buddha's head. The now destroyed face of the sculpture, borrowed from my earlier painting, is a combination of various female poets. An amalgamation of sorts, in the sense that the way I constructed the sculpture, its connection is to pleasure pillars, which I created at the time of 9/11. Actually, I was making this work and 9/11 happened. I had a show at the Asia Society that got postponed. And so I had the work, and I have a habit of continuously painting into my work. So this for me was, this image of the face with the horns was also an image of sort of an image of resistance to counter the very patronizing and a paternal rhetoric for war to save Muslim women. So it was, for me, I chose this, but it was also, a lot of my work engages with radical feminist poets, because I often think of each painting as an idea of a poem. So Bell Hooks, Adrienne Rich, Solmaz Sharif, Amita Riaz, Angela Carter, Rebecca Solnit, like Claudia Rankin, like Praveen Shakir, like it's many, many people, that Banu Kapil, Helen Sissou. So there is this idea of how such thinkers assist in new ways of thinking as part of the broader processes of transformation in a society. And such radical feminist thinkers offer counter perspectives to our prevalent hyper-masculinized histories and ways of being. So that whole idea of how my iconography breaches national boundaries has always been prevalent in the actual making of the work, in the movement between languages of formal languages, actual spoken languages, and also in terms of finding what is fecund in the in-between space. Witness is an allegory of the power, or rather the lack thereof, that women are accorded within the justice system. In an unexpected way, it has lived up to its name. The work is now a witness to also fissures in the country. Now, NOW, which was also a little bit of a reference to National Organization of Women, gains political weight as she rises from her own plinth, her lotus, amongst the 9 statues of ancient male lawgivers. The lotus, with its plethora of meanings and abstract ideas, is symbolic of deeper truth beyond its form. It can allude to illusion, perception. The invisible roots of the lotus that lie below the depths of the water, of course, are echoed in the piece as well. But it also expresses intangible ideas of awakening and clarity. Femininity, to me, is the tension between women and power, how society perceives such a dynamic, and how erasure is enacted by the social forces that shape women's lives. So even when I was making this work, I wanted again to say that it didn't just emerge one day, that I had to make, because there was a lot of critique also on the lotus itself, having been taken as a symbol of Hindutva. So here I was talking about the very ubiquitous nature of lotus in many Asian cultures, as well as Asian iconography. But I had already worked with that idea in the 90s in many of my paintings. So I was literally taking elements from, as I said earlier, from a very intense period of a decade where I put forth a lot of ideas, but they were all in small format, in these detailed paintings. And oftentimes, seeing a painting at this scale here, you have to realize that it's sometimes 7 inches, 8 inches. So imagine walking into an exhibition and a work that may have taken myself to have made maybe like 2, 3, 4 months at a time. And I never had help. So I was always working on my work myself. And then so much detail and information that's packed inside would often get lost, because if you didn't unpack the painting, it would often sit in storages. So that was also this idea that the sculpture was going to allow me to unpack the layers of history. But obviously it happened 20 years later. So there is an interesting sort of parallel in ways in which I repurpose archives for creative repurposing. But also my own work has kind of been subjected to the fate of an archive. So the work in bronze was also about a patina, how to highlight that classical painted statuary was polychromatic and not necessarily lily white, as often constructed over time in popular imagination. So color prejudice points out, the historian Sarah Bond, how we color or fail to color classical antiquity is often a result of our own cultural values. So for me, connecting the patina to these larger discussions on color and classical sculpture were also about linking the issues of classicism with American monuments and memorials that are often revered as symbols of patriotism in their classicism aesthetic. So I was on this mayor's committee in 2017 for city art monuments and markers. And at that time, I was able to examine all these very tension-ridden situations of how communities hold on to memorials, or how, what we mean with historical reckoning and mediations and tensions regarding representation. So at that time, I was also inspired to have an urge to respond. But I was already thinking that so much of my work engages with history, but it doesn't glorify history. So I wanted to call my work an anti-monument. And I'd always called it an anti-monument, but because it was always small works on paper, nobody would use that language. It would often just get hijacked in terms of my biography or who you were from. So no matter what you were doing, you were always going to be pigeonholed in terms of your in terms of identity or in terms of race. So I thought, okay, here's another opportunity to take an image like the one here that I did and make that into a sculpture. So this particular project was, I was like it was gleaned from art history's classicism and ethnocentric reactions to Indian art as per Winckelmann's doctrine, and enmeshed mannerism, the anti-classical impulse within the Western tradition. So kind of using that and the Indian art both as accomplice witnesses of a one-sided history. But I was also reading Partha Mitter's Much Maligned Monsters, so the MoMA play was on that. So this image was on the banner, but it was also in a 2-inch little tiny sketch that you see on the painting here, kind of lost in the background. And I pulled that out and I was like, I'm going to make a sculpture of that. So the works, of course, you can see that there is where they're coming from, an allegory with Venus and Cupid, Bronzinos, and then also the Indian Devata, which at that time, 20 years ago, I was already pointing finger that this was had a very problematic provenance. So which is why I was creating this relationship. And that was returned by Met to India in 2023. So Gayatri Gopinath wrote an essay in a book called Promiscuous Intimacies, and the title for this work is borrowed from that. The sculpture, with its sinuous entanglement of the Greco-Roman Venus and the Indian Devata, explores the promiscuous intimacies of multiple times, spaces, art historical traditions, bodies, desires, and subjectivities. In their suggestive embrace, the entwined female bodies bear the symbolic weight of communal identities from across multiple temporal and geographic terrains. So women in my art function as agents. I call them as agents or protagonists of change and resistance, but also nurture and power. They may be, I often think of them also as perhaps a counter narrative, or they could have redemptive possibilities to the very extractive iconographies or the exploitative extractive forces. So how to have that tension again? So themes in the work touch on struggle, conflict, memory, migrancy, and tradition, but of course the ultimate frame against which experience unfolds, which is death and its opposite life. So there are multiple works that I have done where I am looking at the representation of this sort of nature of the feminine iconography as something that can, how it can perhaps promise abundance, and what the redemptive possibilities can be. So I did a whole series called on these Christmas trees. And in Land of Tears, the gifts that you saw beneath the tree are two female forms, one living, one skeleton, holding on to one another for affirmation and support, as though summoning the strengths of ancestors. But the motif itself was based on a photograph of an oil pumping platform from a 1962 British Petroleum magazine, in which, when I had seen it, I discovered that the rigs were known colloquially as Christmas trees, but they did not look as such. So I took that idea and ran with it and made the pipe branches and chain garlands, etc. But I had also called, we had written to the photographer to check in and see, he was alive, and it was really amazing to see how that, the nature of the situation in terms of the petroleum histories, because I was working on Parallax, which was for the Sharjah Art Biennial. So I wanted to develop a work that dealt with these extractive iconographies in the region and its entire history of the Strait of Hormuz. So just sharing that how context allows one to do research, and how the research then can lead to iconographies that can happen, and they can fluctuate in your practice and be part of the animations and the films, but then can also be fodder for large drawings and paintings. So coming back to this concept of working between the drawing and animation, I ended up making a film which was called Reckoning, which also dealt on the relationships that embody a moment of reckoning between migrant, citizen, women and power, or human and nature. So the upheaval that would be embodied in that idea of that tree was also embodied in the uprooted tree about homelessness of the modern era. And that's sort of as a lurking threat of possible eco-catastrophe, as well as the capacity to use the inner turmoil from dark to light as a defining feature of the creative spirit. So all of these drawings that have led into the animation, and then the animations can be anywhere, right? So I was able to share them at the Midnight Moment in 2015 and in 2023. So the musical score that accompanied was written by the composer Duyan, who won a Pulitzer Prize in music in 2017, and it also features Pakistani singer Zeeb Bangash. And it was really fantastic to be able to share the work with other Asian artists, other Asian female artists. So I think, again, finding ways in which not just the lexicon of the drawn archives can be visited and revisited for collaboration, but also how forms and ideas may speak instantaneously to music and movement, and while some may hint at sculptural directions. So I leave all these possibilities open for more ideas to fall in place, sometimes through dreams, but most of the time through collaboration and reflection and mental discussion and actual experimentation with physical material. So my artistic process always starts with reading, with research, engaging with community, careful listening, and working across media, where I can cull stories that center women. What is women's sense of self versus someone else's idea of us? So I wanted to point also to my interest in colonial histories. Historically, the movement of objects and bodies, such as in trade, slavery, migration, colonial occupation, has forced meaning to shift and oscillate with every generation. When one thinks in terms of narratives and how history, including art history, is determined, how real is that account? All histories are about redactions, where often the highest bidder gets to tell the story. So here was my little experiment on that, where women would take over this sort of a stage, looking into the manuscript tradition, and then as they left their hair behind. So a trace of their being was left, but that was allowing me to then create multiple associations and use it as a particle system to choreograph movements and move from drawing into film. So power in the time of East India Company isn't really all that different than today. Power is exercised across nations and boundaries through networks of corporations and supranational institutions. Empire is now expressed by a transnational ideology of global privatization. All resources are gathered in the rubric of monetization, language, labor, human intelligence, all of them. So a lot of this work that I'm sharing with you right now is based on such notions, whether it's disruption as rapture, reckoning, the last post, bending the barrels, empire follows art, states of agitation. Such works that are made as film, but also have been born out of thinking and writing and using drawing as a libretto, working with composer, traveling, working with poets, thinking, constructing ideas all together. All of this, I feel like such works allude to the interstices, the transitory, the mythos of the migrant, the citizen, the colonized, the artist. All those that are caught, all of us, that are caught between worlds, artistic vocabularies, cultures, practices, and histories. South Asia has had more than 200 years of colonization. Missionary and colonial histories and imperial policies are deeply entrenched in many parts of the colonized world. How we negotiate this complex inheritance can offer creative insights. So the films that I've done, including these works that I've done actually in the economics building at Princeton, they examine these contested histories and mechanisms of power and cultural authorities and tensions over economic control. So whether it's looking at the East India Company, strapping Adam Smith in that attire with wings, unable to fly, or whether I'm looking at the Strait of Hormuz or thinking about the opium trade in between East India Company and China. So all these different notions of that concept are kind of through. They run as a through line in many of these drawings and related animated discursive nature of this drawn and animation simultaneously. And often I end up creating if I've had the opportunity, I welcome it to write about the work that I make. So because I think it's very hard for anybody to get inside the head of an artist, because there's always so many ideas, and then so I often enjoy that idea of how to think of drawing as a writing tool. Motifs and trenchant historical symbols, how they can be given shifting identities, how can they cultivate new associations, whether through movement, repetition, magnitude, velocity. So even when I'm making 3-channel single image works, they don't just happen overnight. They also are elaborate in the same way as like a manuscript painting tradition. If you sit and make an artwork, it may take months. And in the same way, I really enjoyed this kind of parallel that though the scale shifts, but there's another engagement with detail and labor that is also at the heart of such work. Ecstasy as Sublime, Heart as Vector was another work that I did when I started making the animated works, and I wanted to think about pixels' relationship to an idea of a unit. So I thought mosaic could translate really well as that. How could I think about the dynamism of the pixel, and then run with that idea? So here's one example of the work, and then here you would see it as a sort of a, both are, the scroll and the parallax are unrolling in a vertical manner, but it's 70 feet, it's stacked up compositional structure. But that whole interplay of color, shape, form, which offers a multiplicity of perspectives as you move up and down the space, as well as how your eye moves along like an mosaic, which I have not grouted, so it's not homogeneous, it's very uneven, and that endows the work also with a sculptural sensibility. But the overarching themes were all often around human economic interconnectivity, this yearning or struggle for truth with references to history, religion, literature, thinking on those tangents again to create like a visual poem. As a parallel, when I think about glass and the material of glass, I'm also thinking glass as a metaphor for light, for strength, fragility, opaqueness, transparency, malleability. So again, another example of bringing that idea through the drawn into public space, here also animated through water. So the questions at the core of my interests really, I think, are around the issue of time. How can art remain valid over time across different geographies, histories, languages? Where does the power lie in an image? So how is time visualized in an artwork? Does art create new ways to experience time? How can a painting erode its historically produced reality, its value-giving mediated structures? And then at the same time, what role does repatriation of objects with suspect provenance play in the accountability of museums? Can it determine how and what we see? And how are beliefs tied to reproduction of cultural knowledge? So in all of this, I do think my commitment to miniature painting exists. It stems really from my desire to diversify a predominantly Eurocentric art history and to question the entrenched organizing principles of museums with regard to what they consider contemporary or historical, especially if the language does not sit comfortably in the lap of Western art history. So my practice takes innovative approaches, considering the material history and infrastructural context of training and apprenticeship through which South Asian art and aesthetics has typically approached the study of this form, including the archive and its availability for creative repurposing. So I just wanted to point out here that when I was studying, painting, miniature painting, for lack of a better word, South Asian Central manuscript tradition, that image on the bottom two images, the one on the left, that is how things would look in a 80s catalog. So it was always through reproduction or the facsimile. It was much later that actually when I was able to see the actual work under a magnifying glass that I saw how alive it was. So I want you to understand that this idea of authenticity is so problematic. Like I am in search of material that doesn't exist in Pakistan. It exists in storages outside of the region because of the colonial histories. So when you're going to position, like question, or well, you're not authentic because you're not operating from within your own culture. Like, I want all of us to think about what that means. I think it's important for me to emphasize also the plurality and influence on Western wealth and culture from histories of trade and exchange. Also to understand that the ancient world, it was not isolated. Trade migration was at its foundation. Yet in Western art history, the Greco-Roman are singled out against the flourishing art traditions of Gandhara and Kushan, just as one example. But what really got me hooked was understanding how European colonial legacy shaped miniature painting's fate. Because most historical paintings reside in collections at the British Museum, V&A, Met, like you saw, Royal Windsor Library, and they were never accessible for those living in South Asia. So as a student, or even in the 90s and early 2000s, majority of this material would not yet have been digitized, and it still hasn't been digitized. So I think in that sense, these were questions that I was even working on when I was thinking about the scroll. Though I'd made the scroll ages ago, but I just wanted to point to this very interesting thing. In that scroll, you see the young girl who is like kind of bringing the viewer into this story of a day or a life, or she is always sort of like kind of a ghost-like character, but other characters are situated in time differently. But later, when I thought of it and I was making the Snapchat lens, I really thought that it was almost that animating that character. And again, you know, drawing a parallel with older works. So the lack of female artists were always, it's never gone away, but they were very much a topic when I was a younger artist, and what it represented in the art world for me, the misogyny women encountered. So the act of drawing literally became about converting erasure into opportunity through wit and candor. Again, I find a lot of my work deals with humor, but obviously I think, how do you encounter these dichotomies of Western or Asian white or Islamic and East? So it's like, these are very problematic discourses. And then, of course, you have to use humor to kind of like create iconographies that I started to happen, which were sometimes androgynous, armless, headless, self-rooted, floating, half-human figures, because they all refuse to belong, to be fixed, to be grounded, or to be stereotyped. So this in-between space became significant, basically because of the absence. So the absence, the untranslatable, the unknowable, all of that started to offer conceptually and emotionally a resistance to the expected. And that is how I'm equating Venice as a site for me in terms of my current show, which is up there co-organized by the Cincinnati Art Museum and the Cleveland Art Museum, and it opened officially as part of the Venice Biennale. So in there are many of my works that I'm sharing here are also in there, but just sharing how, you know, some of these characters were resisting the racial straitjacketing. And they were also sometimes born out of looking at representations of shadowless forms that would accompany Islamic art books or would accompany art of Indian art. So like, who were these little characters? And without context, so if they could be little monsters that could crawl out of their representation and pages and then decide however they wanted, who they wanted to be. So when I thought of it this way, I was using the lens, the female lens, to make those kind of characters become more sort of like radicalized through a feminist lens, but also in a playful manner. So you can see that some of those sketches were directly linked to such photographic sources. Forms which we often understand as Venetian, they often appear in Islamic patterning. There's a rich history of trade between Venice and Persia, China, and more. And it results in mixed and borrowed motifs and iconographies that reverberate through the Italian Renaissance paintings, as well as illuminated manuscripts of Central South Asia and textiles of the Islamic world. So this relationship between paper, textile, glass also was very key for me throughout my practice, but also I think in terms of like working in particularly exhibiting the work in Venice. And here, I'm sorry, I was a little slow there, but I think I'm going to end right here. But Venice, as its legacy as an artistic hub, its cosmopolitan history and the international crossroad, even the palazzo itself had like layers of Gothic and Moorish and Byzantine. All these syncretic histories that I was interested in illuminating or through juxtapositions of work. So not in any overt way, but as you walk through the space, you start seeing connections that were so unexpected happen. And it's not that I was able to choose this venue. It was basically, we had to respond to the venue in a very short time. So naturally, the nature of the work started to resonate with the venue itself. But at the core of it was literally glass. Like, how could I use glass to make visible the states that are the in-between, especially between elasticity and hardness? And as a creative material, how it can be sort of almost like a lens through which you could maybe break or shatter fixed definitions of the other, because the concept of the show was also foreigners everywhere. So how can you, maybe what happens when you look through a lens, and whether it's the lens of the art, or whether it's the lens of pulp and water that are made here, or whether it's the lens of looking back at history to move forward, or whether it's the lens of looking literally, as I said, between the histories of trade and migration, but also who is in a position of power to tell the story. So I think in that sense, the hierarchy is always the highest bidder gets to tell the story. I think I will end here because I'm not sure, maybe I took too much time, but I appreciate.
Well, you are one impressive woman, I have to say. It's so moving to me to see the amount of work that you've done. And it makes me feel like art history is really what is mostly missing from people's education. Because what you've been able to do, of course, is your extraordinary mind, but you have looked at the history of art and made it fresh. And it's so moving to me.
Thank you so much. That's very meaningful for me, because I often struggle, as I said. I've lived, I'm as an artist for many years, but in the US also since the early 90s. And I'm just shocked to see that oftentimes, most of the times, people don't know where to place you.
Well, but in America, they don't know where to place themselves, because the sense of, but truly, it's if you think about if anybody down in Texas had any clue about art history, could they have done that to that statue? They could not have misunderstood. But there's so poor background in America, and you bring such a depth of knowledge to your work that is, I can understand, is challenging.
Yeah, but it's less about art history. It's just about being aware of what's happening in the world, what surrounds us, right? So I think in that sense, it's playful, because obviously I would need to have another lifetime to understand how an art historian or how art history functions. There's so much there. So as somebody, as a visual artist, or as an artist, you can take a lot of liberty in terms of, the freedom I have in citing things or misplacing them or chronologically or imagining them, and because oftentimes, like I think when I was a young artist, it was shocking to me to realize that so much of the text around, say, South Asian manuscript painting traditions was so Orientalist and coming from an outsider source, in the sense that somebody else was writing about it, and I often felt like it was very reductive, or didn't feel like as if these paintings were supposed to be embraced because they were intelligent and smart and fun, but were supposed to be seen as sort of derivative or lesser than the Western art history. So that obviously as a young artist was like very intuitive, like this is really kind of weird and I'm not interested. But then not having access to the actual material, or not even understanding what the actual material was, like the abundance of it, and not having that anywhere near me. So I think, and then also that so much of the attributions were often made up. So I was like, well, how come no woman painted?
So I was curious, is that true that no women were? You just don't know.
As I said, I'm an visual artist. I can take a lot of liberties. So I was like, I refuse to believe that.
Well, it's like it was only male monks that wrote all the books. I mean, we pretty much know that, but I'm curious. But
well, women were
the fine hand, you would imagine, would be almost required.
But women
are busy.
Women were writing poetry. They were novelists. Women were thinkers. Women were behind power. It's like why are there no attributions to any women in terms of the manuscript painting? Like that's a really interesting topic. But as I said, I need another lifetime to be an art historian.
So I have a question, and I'm interested. You have an extraordinary scope of work, and it feels to me that there's no material that you're afraid of. And I'm just wondering what it was that provoked you to make things move.
I was thinking faster, and the style of painting that I had been dedicated toward was so slow. So my mind would race at different speeds. And I had to be patient to move the painting an inch at a time, for months. And it just, after a while, it probably was that, like frustration. But I already had sort of, to some degree, conquered that, because when I was like a teenager and working like that, I had no friends, very, very few friends, because I was working all day long. So I think in that sense, it was like meditation. But as a 19-year-old, a 20-year-old, it was just a very difficult situation to be in. So that, but I had to sort of, I had to get to that point. So I think when I started making videos, it was also through murals first. So making murals was very physical and fast, but large. And I was running around with actually graffiti artists. And I met Margaret Kilgarren and Barry McGee. That was like 90s in San Francisco. And then I think large-scale wall drawings started to lead into drawings that were put on top of them. And then eventually that sort of layering kind of worked well in Photoshop. And then you started to thread it together and tell a story. And then also to break out of the preciousness of the small object. Suddenly you could share the work with others. You could send it anywhere. It was accessible.
And keep it out of storage. Well, and keep it,
Yeah.
I mean, it was moving also what you spoke about in storage, because we all of us who know anything about art know how much is missing, that the rich people have put things in storage and may never be seen until they trade it to the next rich person. So the idea of having something that's projected or animated or, you know, that can be widely shared in its own perfect form in a sense, not like the bad reproductions of the Persian miniatures that was shocking, but true. The drained color and all of that. So there is a kind of joy in thinking about sharing on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very critical for me to work in high resolution or in good resolution.
Yeah.
And to work with people that could educate me. And, you know, I collaborate all the time, but most of the people that I've collaborated with, our relationships are long-term. So we've been working together and growing together. So in that sense, I've been really lucky to work with people that I met in, you know, years ago. And everybody was drawn to each other because everybody was sort of searching to collaborate in a meaningful way, not just to farm something out because it's cheap somewhere.
Right.
You know, but like that is a whole system in the art world too.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, look, it is a part of the sort of task of what it is we have to do. But I find the work very exciting. I'm very happy that you're here with us at Yale for a while, because I feel like you're going to create a lot of explosions just because the work is so it's critical in terms of its historic sense, but it's also, as you say, it's witty and it's friendly and it's accessible, and it's very exciting. So I'm happy that you're here, and I hope we'll get to play. We have some plans. So I don't want to.